Okay. I'm seeing the number of people filling in. So what I'll now do is I'll give some preamble to the material that I'll be discussing. So basically it's giving an extension, right? If you're a closing speaker. Um, and I have thought a little bit about why this is a fascinating topic. Um, so BP debate is not a fair game. It's like this is why I think it's a lot more exciting than Asians as a format. Um, so in BP, right, it's like there's a dynamic system where if you are just debating against someone else normally, it's just you versus one person. Like on average, you will win, right? Like you will have one who is better, theoretically more skilled. Um, then they would win. They would win that debate, right? They usually win the debate. But when you bring in closing, suddenly you multiply the amount of interactions between teams. Um, and at the heart of that is the extension. Because on one half, it's affected by what opening teams tend to run as they um, describe or provide the landscape of the game. But the interesting thing about closing is like, okay, what do you do afterwards? And that's why I think extensions are a bit harder to deal with than arguments. Extensions are harder to deal than just normal arguments because extensions require a lot more forethought and a lot more context than just an argument. You can practice giving just an any old argument in front of a screen, but it's a lot harder to train the skills to be actively listening during a round and then after listening during the round, come up with the right words to say during the round, and then afterwards say the right words to say, and hope that you didn't plan it wrong. So it's a complicated series of skills that um, are not part of the normal argumentation skill set, which is why we have a lecture that's dedicated to building extensions in British parliamentary. So, as an aside, by the way, I've been sent a list of questions. So what I will do is like over the course of the lecture, I will address those questions and then I will just say it out loud because I know that there was a list of questions given beforehand, like some people wanted to ask. So anyway, so that's why I think British parliamentary is interesting because the presence of close it makes a dynamic game. It makes it a game where um, the way one person reacts can be different to how another person would react, and the way that would interact with the third person is suddenly a lot more different than just between two teams. So, um, that's also so one of the questions here was like, is BP harder than AB? I actually think in some ways it's a bit easier than AB. I have found British parliamentary debating to be much easier. In Asians, it feels like you have to defeat the entire team. In British parliamentary, at least until the finals, you only have to get second. So I actually think BP is not harder than Asians, but it's a lot more complex and therefore interesting. In fact, it's usually the case that if you're closing, it's pretty easy to get second. Like in getting first is quite hard in BP tournaments, but I actually think getting second might be the easiest thing to work on in your debate career to suddenly start breaking at every tournament you go to. Getting second's a lot easier than getting first. Anyway, um, sorry, I'll make another note. I'm a bit scatterbrained today. You're allowed to ask questions at any point during the lecture, either through a comment on the Google Doc or just by sending it in the chat. I prefer that you send it as soon as possible rather than waiting for me to like figure out that you sent it or think of a response on the spot as I say it. It would be much better if you just send it right away, and then I can think about my answer as I'm speaking. Okay, so where was I? So what are the roles and obligations of closing half teams? So let's start first by zooming back a bit, right? So I've talked a little bit about why extensions make British parliamentary interesting, and I think that's why they're at the heart of the sport and they're at the heart of any debate, right? Because closing teams have to think of an extension, opening teams have to plan around against the extension. So it's at the heart of British parliamentary debate. So I think that's what makes it so interesting. But that's also what makes it sort of it seems like it consumes the whole thing, but actually, closing half teams actually have two responsibilities. So other than extend, um, they have to respond, and there is a marginal. Decreasing marginal value. The more you specialize or focus on one. If you just keep giving extensions, well, technically you might have more material on the board. If you don't respond to pre-existing content, then judges will give those opening teams the benefit of the doubt. So in fact, or if you respond too much, then sometimes you'll just get the fourth because you have nothing new to add to the debate. So um, you have to think about the roles and obligations of clothing half teams. Extending is only half your duty. So that has a couple of interesting implications for us that make it different from just arguing. one of the things is that when you extend, right, you're not just thinking about if what you're saying is true and if it's also important to the debate, but now you also have to asking yourself the question, is it true versus what my opponents are saying that may contradict the truth value of the statement? Or is it more important than what an opponent has said rather than just is it important? So that's why it's so important to think about extension as not just an interesting flavor of an argument, but rather something that changes the roles and obligations of teams between each other. And more importantly, it adds to the amount of complications that a closing team will face, because you have to balance it against other responsibilities. So someone just asked me a question: How long will we learn? I'll give a lecture for about 50 minutes, and then I'll give the rest of the time for Q&A, maybe 45 minutes. And then after that, I think there's a spar plan. I will not be available for the spar. So those are the rules and obligations of closing half teams. So as I said, the marginal value of it, right? It means you want to have some balance. But the thing is, though, these aren't useful. These aren't useful ways to think about debating because if you just say I want to extend and I want to respond, that's just like saying, oh, that's just like saying I want to be good at debating. Like I can't make a lecture that and the only piece of advice is like be good or extend well or respond well. So we have to break this down into goals that you can work towards. And also somebody has suggested to delete the entire document. That's not very nice. Um, please don't do that. Anyway, so and these goals sort of emerge even after um, these goals emerge even after you think about how do I want to extend, how do I want to respond well? Because one of the things will be you are extending against other teams' arguments and extensions, which means now you can't just run an extension, you have to run a good extension. And that extension can't just be a normal extension, or you can't just do that. Um, okay, I would just change the link to comment only because people keep uh, making suggestions that kind of make the image hard to see. Uh, and I'll do that later. Anyway, yeah, please stop suggesting stuff. You can comment material on the document. I can send the file again. Where was it? Okay, so yeah, so there are some emergent goals that arise out of extensions and response. So it's not just that you want to run an extension, but you want to run a good extension. It's not just that you want to run a response, but you want. Oh, someone stopped screen sharing there. Okay, you know what? Maybe I can just screen share it. Many such complications today, but it's all right. That's the life we live. Okay. Hi. I think people can see my screen, so I'll just continue to where I was. So, yeah. So you want to run an extension, and that's part of a big part of the debate. You want to safeguard against the whip, so it's not just that you want to respond to arguments that you've heard already, but that you also want to ask about. Maybe this was a mistake. Anyway, or you want to respond to some things that have not yet come up. Because at this point, there's only one way you can lose if you have beat the opening half, which is losing to the other side's whip. And of course, it's not just that you want to run a good extension, but that you also want to think about materials that already exist in the debate. So maybe one thing that you can say is that our argument is not very different from what the opening has, but the reason why it's important is because this small addition is much more important than opening government's addition to the debate. So the emergent goals of extension are not just in the matter of proving things that are true or proving things that are important, or even proving things are better than your opponents, but also in addition to this, re-clarifying or recontextualizing other bits of material you have. So is extension similar to characterization? Yes, in the sense that an extension is an argument or a contribution to the debate that you run at closing. So it's more like characterization can be an extension, but not always. So um, I'm gonna assume that people here know how to argue already. Like they've not like they're not total novice. There's like some experience prior with debate. Um, so let's assume that you know how to make an argument, and let's assume that the structure you've chosen for your argument is premise. Premise, analysis, conclusion, and then what if, and then the label of the argument. So let's say that you've decided to make arguments in that way. If you're running an extension, what you are doing is adding one bit to that checklist or that list of ingredients you have. So you'll have a checklist, and then at the top of that checklist, you will say, why is this argument new? So an extension is basically that because closing teams have to not just contribute to the debate, but contribute in a way that their opening has because they can lose to their opening, even if they're technically smarter or better at arguing. Okay. Someone asked how if I have a question, is that if one side wins and the two teams on that side win? No. Sometimes it can be the opening government and then the closing opposition winning. Okay. So let's continue. So the reason for why this is hard, the reason for why running a good extension is hard is actually because a lot of things take time. As nice as it would be to run every extension you could run and spend 50 minutes thinking in prep for new things to say, there are natural constraints. So this is not very revolutionary, but like you want to think about ways to reduce the amount of time it takes to think about your argument, to say your argument, to um, to have the available facts and sort of key pieces to put the argument together, and so on. So what you should actually be doing is in during prep and during the rest of the debate, when you're thinking about an extension, you want to think about it in terms of how long it would take to think about the argument um or to come up with it or to ideate it or put it together, and then also the amount of time it takes to say an argument. I think an obvious reason for why this is the case is because one of the things that people do for extensions is that they think of an idea that is really good, um, but it actually doesn't make any sense. And what happens is that they've not thought about that argument too much, but the label of it sounded quite impressive, and so they didn't spend more time pondering it. And so that will either manifest by you not really explaining it all that well, or by the judge like just not valuing it in the debate. So think time and speech time. Speech time because that'll end up taking a long time to explain, and think time because like you didn't spend so much time thinking about it, so there's a misallocation of resources. So one of the things to notice again, sorry, wait, I need to get a drink of water if I can. Okay, I lost track. Um, ah, yeah, so the limited resources you have, speech time and think time. So in terms of extension, this means that you want to think about how to achieve your goals. You want to think about how to achieve the goals that are set out for you, like in the debate, and also what you want your extension to do. So a good way to think about extensions is to think about it running backwards. So you can think about it going forwards in the sense of I think of a true fact about the debate or about the real world, and then I can think one step further from that fact, and then one step further from the fact, and then eventually it leads to a compelling argument. Or you can think about it the other way around, which I think a lot of people neglect to do. So you can think about writing extensions as writing about the goals you want or the ways you want to conclude the debate, and then working backwards from what you would need in order to say that. So let's say one thing you might do is you might think of a closing extension as we already have one extension that's pretty safe and it's pretty much guaranteed to be an argument, but it's not a very brave or a very big argument. And so you think to yourself, my goal for this the second argument is to run an extension that's not like that, that is quite high risk but also very very high reward. And then you think, okay, I want an argument like that. Is there an impact like that that we can derive from the debate? Doesn't seem like it. Oh, maybe if I think about this context or this point of premise, maybe I can extend it there. And then you work backwards until you have a fully formed argument from the bottom up. So one bit to extensions is to always think about how you need to achieve your goals. So what are some practical bits to do that other than just the heuristic I gave? In general, you have three rules of thumb in order to think about achieving your goals as closing. So first is you want to run a good extension. So here the first piece of advice is to identify what was run. So it was asked in a question before, but also asked by Tanjiro from Demon Slayer. How can closing teams do well if the opening team has already covered most of the arguments? The first thing you need to do, by the way, in order to understand that, is to identify what was run already, as in, um, like if you already have a good idea of what was said and then you tell the judge that, it becomes clear that the argument is different from what you were saying. Also, it becomes clearer to you because in sometimes in prep or in in the middle of the round, you will absolutely convince yourself that you've come up with something new, but only because it sounds new in your head. But the moment you say it out loud to the judge, it actually doesn't make any sense. So if you plan already to identify what you said and what was run already and clarify the difference between those two, it'll actually clarify that sometimes you've thought of something that actually isn't new and you've just sort of Kool-Aided, you've coped yourself into thinking it's or believing it's a new argument. Anyway, so how can closing teams do well? Well, you first have to identify what was run beforehand, which is again part of running a good extension. So you have to identify what was run beforehand, and then you have to explain what you're doing is better than what they're doing, which is naturally what you want to do anyway. I think so. The thing that Jira is asking was, what if opening has already covered most of the arguments? In reality, all you have to do then is first explain that the arguments that opening has talked about deal with the less important part of the debate or are a smaller impact in addition versus the impact that you have in your argument. So it's like if if they come up with like 4 points that are like okay, or 3 points that are okay, but you only have 1 point, but your 1 point is a lot better, then all you have to do is explain the quality of that point. Um, so that's pretty much the to answer your question. If other than that, you can also make an argument out of a response to another team. If you responded really well and you say this adds a lot of value to the debate or this adds a lot of value to the discussion, you can win even without running a single argument as long as your responses are really that substantive. Okay, back to the material. So how to run a good extension. So that's point one, and then point A of point one is so you have to identify what was run. One heuristic to do this, by the way, is to make things easier for you. You should preempt the debate by thinking about what your opponents are going to run in opening, and then after you think about all those arguments, then you start writing your own arguments. So what you can do actually is like if for government bench, you can try and think of two more arguments than you would normally think of, and then cross out the most obvious two arguments. So actually, you can speed up the time it takes to write down to identify what was said if you're already thinking about what they were going to say before they've said it, and then you're just checking if they actually said it or not. Anyway, so that's the first bit. Obviously, if you identify what was run, that means you don't say it, and think of what was already responded to, and what teams are doing well. So it's not just good enough to say they said this or they said that, but actually you should also be in addition asking yourself, is it still true? Slash, do I still believe it? And are there ways I can improve on it? So you don't just give up on what was run already when you're coming up with an extension and for British parliamentary, but you're also thinking about is the argument that you're saying better or worse? So one example would be, let's say you have a motion, and the motion is like we want to have a carbon tax, which is the motion I always use for teaching debates. So let's say the argument from opening government is that we want the carbon tax because it will make companies that are bad for the environment shut down, and that means that they'll stop polluting, which is good for the environment because the tax is so high on very polluting companies. And then you say at closing, oh, we also have the impact that we help the environment, but our argument is that the tax creates an incentive businesses to uh, for businesses to innovate and to research better, less carbon inefficient ways of doing whatever they're doing. And then you say, so this leads to a larger impact in addition to the same impact. And then what this can do is what it is think about when thinking about your extension in terms of doing something that you're opening better or doing it something more believably, then that's already an extension because it is a way of comparing your material to the opening team while also trying to put yourself above them. So again, that's really all extension is, just trying to beat your opening and then coming up with a good enough argument. Um, One thing to think about when running a good extension is that there is typically an efficiency trade-off. The ideas that tend to be pretty good tend to be hard to explain. So you're thinking about ideas, so you should be picking ideas that are at the top of one or the other, or try their best for both. So you want arguments that are very intuitive and very strong. These ideas are not super common, but there are quite many themes of these ideas that will recur in debates, even if the debates themselves vary by quite a lot in specific topic. So, for example, one theme that comes up pretty often is that if you have one thing, adding more of that thing makes it better because there's competition, which means the owners of that thing or whoever's running that thing or the things themselves need to be picked, or there's a harm if they end up there's many of them, so they're fighting over similar resources or suppliers or customers. Um, and then competition, the end outcome is if there's more of them, then they compete to do better. And since they compete to do better, they end up becoming better. That's a theme that recurs pretty often in closing. It happens in like tech debates, it happens in feminism debates, it happens in IR and philosophy. Um, and so uh, the thing to solve the efficiency trade-off is actually it's not like improving your brilliance or IQ, because honestly, that's one kind of impossible to do. And two, it's not really tangible in any sense. But one way you can just have better ideas is to know better ideas and to be a more worldly person. So you can think of compelling harms that you can easily describe, which pop to your head, but also direct ideas that have intuitive metrics, direct ideas that are immediately compelling to a person just because of the way that it comes out, that it affects a more vulnerable group of people or affects more people, or it's a more likely harm. Another example of something that's a very strong idea is just accept something that they said is true and then just say why instead of it being bad, it's good. So one example is in the motion where you have asymmetric warfare, where you have like a guerrilla group or the smaller group in war fighting a larger group in war, and that the larger group is very strong. Um, and then the motion is about if the small actor should be allowed to commit war crimes or if they should themselves choose to commit war crimes. And then the argument from one side would always be if they commit war crimes, they will have a better chance of winning, and they will be able to survive longer and they will be able to fight back harder. And then the response of the other side is always going to, it would ideally be, yeah, you fight on for longer, but you will inevitably still lose. And what happens is that you delay peace and the chance to rebuild your country, which means there's more years of suffering for your side. And that type of distinction is a pretty clear and easy way to win the debate because it's compelling. Because if you believe what they said, then all you have to do is believe the framing from your side on top of what they said to win the debate. Uh, and the other thing is that it's an incredibly intuitive metric, right? Because it's literally what you're doing. You're changing the evaluation of the debate by arguing directly about what is being said, rather than trying to prove something new about the world. You're just changing how we think about that thing in the world. So one example could be saying something that they thought was good is actually quite bad. And then one thing that you could say is that, oh, prison private prisons have an incentive to take on prisoners, um, and that's really really good. And then the response would be to take that good thing and to explain it into something bad, which becomes immediately intuitive because you are of course explaining why they are bad. So you are directly explaining the intuition. By construction, it is intuitive. So the argument here would be something like private prisons have an incentive to take on more prisoners. Then you say so private prisons incentivize and lobby for governments to be harsher on prisoners, to stimulate something called the prison industrial complex, and to make laws harsh in order to make a lot more money because of the incentive that you've given to them to take in more prisoners. So that's the first bit. Basically, how do you run a good extension? Identify what is run, identify what is responded to and what teams are doing well. And then of those ideas that interact with it by saying we improve upon something that was done before, or we defeat or reconstruct something that was responded to, or we defeat something of the opponent's side, then you're able to bring out a direct and clear and compelling idea. Then you have a good extension. Okay, I'm realizing I prepared a lot of lecture content that I won't be able to finish, so um, I would just leave you with the rest of the lecture, like with however much of the lecture is left after I'm done. So I'll finish as much as I can until then. But if not, then you will just have the notes and you can ask me questions about about the notes. Um, okay, so moving on from there. Um, that's the first bit of doing well in extension and closing. But actually, it makes sense to not just contemplate giving extensions um, in the how do I think about it? Hmm. You don't just think about extensions as its own encapsulated thing, but rather as related to and oppositional to the other obligation of closing themes, which is to respond to a pre-existing argument. Um, and you can actually make your extensions a lot better by thinking about doing the other thing while you are extending. In other words, how do you integrate responses into your extensions? There was a circuit norm, like I don't know how many years ago, back when I was in high school, where it would be like, oh, uh, if you're really cool and you're really good at debate, you say that you integrate your rebuttals, because that's so hard and it's so cool. And like I don't know where I got that impression from. I think from my high school seniors, but in the end, integrating rebuttals is not a big deal, and actually, it's pretty useful, and most people should know how to do it because of how much value it adds to debating. Which is that if you think about rebuttals, you have five choices, right? If because again, back to what I talked about, your let's pursue this imaginary debater makes arguments in from the structure of label, premise, analysis, conclusion, and so what, or the meta. So, when you're rebutting, you really have five choices available to you, and you can pick one of five flavors of response. You respond to the example slash label, which isn't really a good idea unless you're just trying to make fun of them, in which case, maybe do it, but don't make fun of people. Secondly, you can also take down the premise, which is pretty useful because it disproves everything that relies on the premise. Three, you can take down the link, which is good because people tend to do the links the most poorly in the argument. You can also take down, fourthly, the conclusion, which is pretty useful because if you prove the conclusion to be wrong, then it doesn't matter what they've said. It's not enough to meet the argument's burden of proof. And fifthly is that, of course, you can if you take down the meta, then even if the argument is very true, you prove that it's unimportant or that it's negative for their side. So you have those choices available to you, right? When you're rebutting. And actually, one of the things that you should think about when you're running an extension is you think about a sentence that you're saying, and you say, is this an interacting premise or an interacting point of material with what the other team say? And if you do think about it that way, then what you can actually do is say, this argument is also responding to their point because it shows and it directly proves the opposite to the argument they've said. This means that this argument is not just valuable because it does this, but it also prevents this benefit. So something like that. Um, so you know how to respond. And then the next question to ask is, among the choices available to you, how can you reflavor or recontextualize something you've already said in your extension as a response? So that's one way of adding value to what you've said because it changes how the judge should evaluate it and also makes it a lot clearer the value of an individual point, not just as a component in an argument, but a response on its own. Secondly, is that when you're extending, you should be picking which arguments are the most important arguments to respond to. That is, if you're extending on a part of the debate that's unimportant or it does not interact with the most important material of the other team, then what will happen is that yes, you are potentially right, but in terms of in technical terms, but actually, it is very damaging. The most valuable resource you have when you are extending is credibility. It's credibility with the judge because the moment the judge like you lose your credibility in front of the judge with an extension and they discard it as it's a rehash or it's not important to the debate or it's out of the spirit of the debate, you pretty much lose. And like you have to spend the rest of the debate fighting back against that impression, which is very hard to dig your way out of. So pick which arguments are most important to respond to. Because if you fail to respond to a pre-existing issue in the debate, either by directly addressing it or by showing an issue that supersedes it in terms of importance or hierarchy, then um, you uh, you lose your credibility basically because you will be seen as arguing, but you will be seen as out of the debate because you have not listened to what previous teams have said. So, how would you know which arguments are the most important to respond to? We use the same intuitive metrics we just discussed. Is it an argument that affects more vulnerable people? Does it affect more people? Is the harm more likely? Is there a principled obligation to this one particular argument? So, I recall there was a debate, and someone in opening opposition had pretty convincingly argued that this impact would lead to like nuclear war. And then the closing speaker said, well, yeah, but what about the rights of the laborers in the factories? Which was, well, probably a pretty good response. All in all, not very compelling. Um, it wasn't a very good round in the end. Um, so you have to pick arguments that are most responded to, and in particular, you use the metrics that will be found most intuitive by the judge to select which space or which issue for your extension to clash onto. So um, this means that if you are arguing within a pre-existing idea, let's say they're like, oh, our argument is that this type of encryption on phones leads to more privacy. And you're like, no, actually encryption is bad because then you lose privacy to companies that now become unaccountable. You can either, oh, okay, somebody has apparently put inappropriate words in the document, so I will restrict the right to edit that document. Sorry, everybody, you have lost all your rights once I figure out how to fix the sharing. All right, I have now restricted it. I hope this means that you can't look at it anymore. I'm not sure if that'll kick off people who are currently on the document, but oh, okay, then it works. Yep. So I'll just keep screen sharing because apparently you have abused your responsibilities. I feel like this high school teacher now.
You could just change
Um,
permissions from like commenting to viewing instead of just
yeah.
locking there.
All right. Chill. Thanks for letting me know. Okay. Um, yeah. All right. I guess people, if people can view it now, then good. We can proceed. But in any case, uh, back to where I was. So, um, so now that you've selected, of course, where you want to place the argument, so either by where was I? By explaining that the it's within a pre-existing clash, or by relating it to the debate when you introduce a new clash by showing something is directly stronger, then you have something that's already within the intuitive metric of the debate. So after all of that, then you have to ask the question, is the response that you're saying or the way that you're approaching the debate like an effective response? Um, so by the way, I suppose this also ends up being a good workshop or a good lecture for how to give a good response, because it tends to be uh, part of running the extension, I guess, which is the material that you're actually saying um, persuasive? So the level of this, the level of burden of proof for this will vary from argument or point to point that you're making. But typically, you wanna evaluate the premises that you're putting in your extension by the value that they add to responding to another argument, rather than just explaining if this extension, if this premise tends to be true or not. Um, like I think this is useful to think about because most debaters at some point or one point or another hit like a wall where they end up actually becoming really good at saying a lot of stuff, but then not really good at picking that from that stuff, and they end up overtiming and not really being good at putting their time together. So yeah, not really good at putting the time together. So that means that you have a very limited selection of stuff, right? You have to put that stuff together in a way that's sensible, but also one where the judge can still understand it, because sometimes you just give too many points and it won't make any more sense. So you have to pick which responses are most effective to run. And then afterwards, think about how you can place the premise within the argument of the debate. So let's say CO responded and destroyed the OG case but fails to provide a new substantive. Well, one thing is to think about is that you should actually only think about the what they say in between each other. So if CO really crushes OG, then OG should lose. Um, and if they fail to provide new substantive, then I guess you can either look at what very little they have in substantive by way of response, or if they only defeat the OG case but they do nothing else and neither teams really say an argument, then probably OG should win because they spoke first. Um, but like this is not really a realistic scenario. Usually teams will have at least a little bit new substantive, and then that can be weighed one team over the other. Anyway, so going back to the idea, which was you want to pick which responses are most effective to run within your argument. So an example of the premise of a premise that you could use here is you could say, um, opposition bench has said that a carbon tax is bad. Let's say opening opposition a carbon tax is good, because you're able to prevent companies from polluting that much. And then at response, you can either build your argument with a premise, with a premise that's like kind of useful, kind of related to the debate, but not super important, like explaining the behavior of like certain groups of people. You could instead say that actually the way that people act is not really all that rational, so that the response itself will be delayed, and so it will actually end up, it will actually end up being that only the only a few companies can stomach the tax, but they will continue to stomach because it will still be more profitable. At which point, when they do that, they will just become monopolies as other companies die out, and then they will go back to producing as much carbon as they used to. So, by responding to another team, and by picking a premise that helps you respond to another team and evaluating on another response, you actually have arguments that add more value to the debate, even without adding to it in a different in the conventional sense, which is you want to add more arguments or you want to add more impact. You want to add more premises, or you want to add more impacts. But actually, you can change or rearrange how you're evaluating your premises and building to pick more effective responses. Okay, that was a bit of a mouthful. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is give people like maybe 1 minute to ask some questions because I realize we're now maybe 10 minutes away from ending. So I'll just go through a few more bits here on how to make your extension safeguard against the whip, and then probably I'll just clear up some other things that I said and respond to some questions, and then I think it'll be over after that. So yeah, 1 minute if people have any questions that they can ask in chat. I'll also answer questions that are coming that I didn't answer yet before. Can you rebut the opening teams? You can rebut your opening opposition, but not your opening government. More specifically, you can't explain that something they said is untrue, except for matters about the meta debate. So you can disagree with opening government if you're closing government um, on what is important to the debate, but you cannot disagree on what is true. Yeah, I've answered this question. Good. I'll answer this question. Answer this question. Answer this question. Somebody is correcting my typos. Thank you. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay. And yep, I really did not expect people to put slurs on this one. Anyway, my apologies. Where was I? So no questions. So I guess either that means I'm doing a poor job or a very good job, or you've already asked your questions. Okay. So let's finish up the final bit on how to come up with a good extension that's important to the debate. So the final other bit is that you want to safeguard against WIP. As I said before, um, if you've already come up with a good enough idea that fulfills everything here, usually you're pretty much winning the debate, right? Usually, if you've come up with an extension that extends, that also responds, that responds to pre-existing arguments, and is a very compelling harm with an intuitive metric, usually you win, right? So that means that at this point, well, my water is my throat is now dry. So usually at this point, the only thing that can end up killing you as a team is if your case can get responded to. So the first thing that you should do is identify the weaknesses of your own extension. And I think you have to be honest about this. No extension is going to be perfect. So typically an extension will have a flaw of sounding unrealistic, or it will have a flaw of being relying on a premise that you can't really add more layers to, or it's not tangible enough. So you want to identify the weakness of your case. And if you cannot immediately fix it in your argument, like if the extension is too abstract, then you add an example, or if the extension doesn't have a large enough impact, then you add more explanation to the impact. Is that if you can't solve it right away, then you can make your extension safeguard against whip by preemptively explaining how you should value responses against it. So other than using your extension as an opportunity to preempt, which is one obvious way to think about it, but this lecture is not about preempting. Um, One other way to think about safeguarding your argument is by devaluing responses or by explaining it preemptively against certain weighing. So one example is if they respond to it by saying it's untrue, then you can say, even if it's untrue, this argument's impact is so large that even if it's quite unlikely, a 1% chance of it happening is still a very large impact in the debate. Like, again, the chance of war or something. And so by um, preemptively devaluing certain responses against it, you can actually safeguard your extension against it. In reality, one of the most productive uses of your time when you're coming up with extensions is by coming up with ways to safeguard against these types of things and to have like sort of tricky or technical bits of way. So one example of this type of thing is you can say all of you said arguments that talked about economic economic value or the ability for this person to make more money in their career, and that is maybe true, but are explained an argument that's a lot more important to it, or an argument that's a lot more ideal to it, which is the principle or what this person should be feeling, or maybe like at the social or emotional level, and then um because you are able to do that, then it's a lot easier to safeguard against whip by preemptively weighing against the weaknesses of your case, explaining, yes, it does clash on with the rest of the debate. That's why it's an interesting and important contribution to the debate, and that's why the judge should value it. So, but that's the first piece of advice, is that you want your extension to safeguard against whip, and you do this by identifying the weaknesses of your cases. Then the second bit is typically it's pretty good to run a lot of material if you're a whip, if you're a closing extension speaker in British Parliament. The reason behind this is that again, you don't always know what's going to be correct. That's why you want, like I said before, to think about what your debate, think about what your arguments will look like in complement to each other. In other words, identifying and how to achieve your goals. Um, but you also want to run more material. So you want to run more material because you want to hedge against you not knowing what the perfect extension will be. So if you want to run a risky extension, typically it's better to safeguard it against whip by responding by creating another argument that has different characteristics to it. So the typical thing here would be if you run two arguments that are kind of unlikely, then they will say it won't happen to both of them, which is a lot more efficient for them, and be doing a lot better. So you want to run a lot of material to safeguard against whip because it gives your arguments more smokescreen and also gives you opportunities to hedge against what your opponents by saying by making it harder for them to respond. That's the second bit. You want to safeguard against whip by giving them a large burden or a large responsibility to respond to your argument, which makes your extensions, your material, a lot easier to go through in a debate. Remember, as an extension speaker, you actually only need one argument to be believed to be true because as an extension speaker, you have sort of full emotion about the opening half of the debate. You have full emotion, full information about the full opening half of the debate because you've already seen them. Which means if you've done your thinking properly, what you say, if it's not responded to, will already be sort of preemptively winning the debate. So um, anyway, that's why that's all that useful. So the other two are pretty similar. I think I was kind of rambling since the very beginning. So I ended up saying the last two bits already in other bits. So yeah, preemptive defenses, you want to preempt other arguments by thinking about your opponent's arguments beforehand, like a long time beforehand, and then hinging it on the other opening team. I guess the other thing to explain for 3 point C for how to for how to safeguard your extensions against whip is by making it hard to rebut because it is saying something that your opening agrees with. So actually, if your opening opposition takes a moderate stance and then you say, we agree with that moderate stance, but it has a benefit for our side, not for your side. And then that makes it hard for closing to contest them on the agreeing on the stance because you can either disagree with the truth of what they say or the importance of what they say. But by agreeing and hinging your extension on a premise that agrees with the opening opposition team, you can safeguard against the closing opposition whip or the opposition whip, or if you're just vice versa, if you're a closing opposition, then you can agree with the opening government to insulate against the government whip. So it's actually a pretty interesting way to safeguard against whip um, by thinking about how to strategically agree with your opponents. You actually create opportunities for extension and new material to be introduced around. Okay. So there's some stuff here that's a bit more nuanced that I don't think I really need to cover anyway, since I realize now that the audience for this lecture is a bit general, where some of you are pretty experienced in debate and some of you are less experienced for debate. So for this stuff, it's a bit more just like my vibes on debating and art isn't really so useful for most people. So I guess I'll really stop it here. So the final thing I'll do now is answer some of the unresolved questions that I didn't get through earlier. So one of the questions that was asked beforehand is um, how to debate on topics you aren't familiar with. So in every tournament I go to, there are always some motions that I'm not familiar with. I do not get the trade-off. I don't get the CAP's intention. And have you encountered situations in major tournaments? And then another related question is that I have in tournaments that I go to, there's always a few motions that I don't really get. So, uh, whoops. Oh yeah. So this is a pretty common thing to encounter when you're doing extensions and even when you're doing opening. Really, there's no excuse. If you don't know how to talk about feminist emotions, you should probably just do debate motions on feminism until you get good at it, or you should read up on the Israel-Palestine conflict, etc. The other thing is not just to read about topics or to learn about topics, but also to watch people debating certain topics, watch people debate certain topics, and then see what issues they tend to gravitate to or what they value as important. So that'll actually make it clear because then you get a good feel for how to get more information sort of about different motion types. But the other thing is that sometimes you just have to cope. Um, so um, if you don't know that much about the topic, first of all, look at what other teams know about the topic, which they can try and make clear through their speeches. But also, secondly, is that instead of explaining sort of some specialist material that you might not know about that would be important to the debate, try and explain the debate in terms of what the judge's perspective might be, which is maybe they're not an expert or they're not familiar also. So try and explain material in simpler and easier to understand ways than your opening team or your other teams. Anyway, that's to answer one of the pre-loaded questions. Some questions here is if extensions really depends on what happens on the round. Does this mean your speech note-taking time has to be reduced to not lose out on opponent's material? I actually don't really. I keep a pretty precise flow of what was said in the round as a judge, but as a debater, I actually don't really spend any time note taking what opponents have said. Usually, I just try and remember what they said as best as I can, or what I do is I change my argument so that my argument preempts it, which means in what I'm gonna say, what I need to write down from my opponent only matters in terms of what I'm gonna say about my opponent, which means I just write it already the moment I hear it. Like if they say a premise, instead of saying writing down the premise, I just write down the response to that premise. So yeah, so extensions really do depend on what happens in the round. The best way to prep your time as closing is to think of arguments and then think of so many arguments that um, that the you at least have some new ones and that your opening one has said anything. How do I become a professor at debating and how do I face a difficult motion? Um, I'm not a professor at debating, and I face difficult motions by bashing my head against them and trying to break them down from complicated motions to simpler motions, like removing certain words or to break them down into less complicated versions of the motion. Like maybe a motion about ride or die relationships is a bit too Gen Z for me or a bit too Gen Alpha for me. Then instead I can say, oh, what about the motion about unconditional love? So you can try and face difficult motions by working up to them in terms of difficult. How where should closing teams start their thought processes? You should like spend maybe 1 minute to understand the motion, and then afterwards you should spend all the rest of your time thinking about new arguments and thinking about them in terms of response to your opponent. How to select the right case? I talked about it in the lecture. Okay. Um, what do you think an effective reflection must have? I can't really apply what I learned from the OA despite hearing it many times. Well, one way to reflect on what's been said about you and incorporate that feedback in the next speeches is to take notes as simply as you can. And then before you start your speech or before you start prep time, read those notes. And then if you, ideally, you should make it so that you don't ever add the same feedback from an OA again. Okay, I think we've moved on from asking about extensions. So I think now's a good place to end. You can end it a bit early so you have some break before the spar. Um, yeah. Any last word or any last question? If not, I'll give it back to the secretariat and
Okay,
the VP.
yeah. Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture, despite the unfavorable situations. So I'm really appreciate for giving us lecture. That was really I think really valuable time for us to learn many things. And okay, I'll end the recording now.